live near a pretty big stretch of woods in my area. It would be a pretty popular tourist attraction if we ever got visitors in town, but we don't, and our woods are about the only thing we have to offer to any traveler. The park has several hiking trails, bike paths, and swing sets, and it's generally been a pretty safe area. This happened late in the summer back in 2018, and I still think about it every day. I was on the tail end of fully rehabbing my ACL, and in turn, I had gained some weight. I decided to start going for night walks up at those woods, and this particular incident happened around my 4th or 5th week of doing so. I usually park in the nature center in the front of the park, which is well lit, where I'd occasionally see a car or two parked in the lot. This night, however, the parking lot was empty, which I always preferred, so I wouldn't have to be worried about my car while I was gone. I pulled in around 8 p.m. and got out with my water bottle, flashlight, and backpack. I took my usual hiking trail, where I'd usually walk for a total of 4 miles. The night was perfect. It was a comfortable temperature, the moon was bright, and the sound of the crickets really made it feel peaceful. The path I was on gets very scenic the further you walk into it, having several points overlooking the vast hills in the distance, along with large ravines and bridges. Once I'd reached the bridge, I typically walked for another minute or two, before turning around and heading back. As I was walking, I sort of went into autopilot. Before I knew it, I was already approaching the bridge, which was right around my halfway point. We had gotten quite a lot of rain in the previous week, so the ravine's current was extra strong, making for a loud and relaxing sound. I decided to stop on the bridge and admire the scene. Although there was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary, I felt a little uncomfortable standing there, realizing I was visible to anything in the woods for miles, since the elevation of the bridge was so high. I decided to finish out the last few minutes of my walk, then turn around and head back. While I was walking, I kept getting this feeling that something was watching me. I didn't understand why, as I'm never a paranoid person, and I'd already been doing this for a month. When I tell people this, they never believe me, but it's almost like I had this premonition of imminent danger. Once I reached the end of the bridge, I stepped back down onto the trail and continued my walk. I'd stop and turn around at this old railroad, which made for a great landmark since it literally ran right through the trail. I reached that point, where I stopped for a few minutes to view the tracks that extended for miles each way. That was when I spotted something that really heightened my anxiety. It looked like someone was walking in my direction along the tracks, maybe 40 feet ahead. I couldn't make out any specific details, but the person looked like they were bundled up in layers. I stepped off the tracks and headed back towards the bridge, this time with a much quicker pace. As soon as I started crossing the bridge, I kept turning around to see if they were following me, and when I looked, I felt my stomach drop. Right at the end of the bridge was a person dressed up in a clown costume. I was familiar with the strange trend back in 2016, but I hadn't really heard anything else about them since. I'm not sure why, but I felt like the best thing I could do in that situation was to talk, so with the drowning sound of the ravine, I yelled, "You got me, that's really scary," and let out a nervous laugh. The figure didn't respond, but rather stood there, completely still. The clown was holding something in its hand, almost resembling the shape of a hammer. I thought that it might be a prop, and tried to tell myself that I wasn't necessarily in danger, but the odd feeling of dread I'd already had was now 100 times worse. I knew that there were certain cases where the clowns became violent, so I took everything very seriously, especially being a young girl who's in the woods by herself at night. I'm glad I did, because as soon as I started running, I immediately heard loud, fast-paced footsteps behind me. I screamed to please stop, but the clown was not letting up. It kept chuckling these creepy guttural laughs, and I was truly horrified. I'm not even sure how long I ran, but the footsteps sounded like they were right behind me the entire time. I eventually reached the parking lot, where I sprinted to my car under a light post. As soon as I got to the door, the clown emerged out of the woods, still repeating the same creepy laugh. I could see much better now that it indeed was holding a large hammer, and I honestly felt like I was going to have a heart attack. Before the clown could reach my car, I peeled out of there and drove straight to the police station. I gave my statement, and the officers were eventually able to pull the security feed from the nature center to validate my story. They had no way of identifying the individual, and I was left without any answers. I remember telling all of my family and friends the following day, and warned them to be on the lookout for any clowns. I really don't think this was a prank. I've since seen plenty of videos of people's encounters with clowns, and I can usually tell when the clown is just trying to scare someone, without any intention of harming anyone. In my case, I know in my heart that this wasn't just a person looking to scare someone for fun. Not only was it out there in the woods by a known hiking area, it chased me to my car for an entire 2 miles. Had this happened a few weeks earlier, I truly believe I would have ended up on the news as another victim to them. I live a very structured life. I'm an ophthalmologist, so my life mainly consists of eating, working, and sleeping. My wife owns a couple salons, so her work schedule can be pretty unpredictable. On this particular night, I was getting home later than usual. The operation was only supposed to last an hour, but after some complications, it ended up lasting over 2 hours long. I didn't get home until 7:30 that night, and I was beat. I hadn't talked to my wife all day and assumed she was already home, but as I pulled in the driveway, I noticed that her car wasn't there. I stayed in the car while I called her, just to make sure everything was okay. While waiting on the line, I noticed through the window that the light to my office room was turned on. My wife never goes in there, and I hadn't been in there for the past couple days. My wife finally answered, and she was out at a company dinner. Before hanging up, I asked her if she was in my office today, but she seemed confused and said no. I told her that the light was on inside, but she hadn't been home since that morning, and she never went in. She started showing obvious signs of worry, so I reassured her that everything will be fine, and I'll check it out. Once we hung up, I got out and started heading inside. I went in through the garage, then grabbed the key to unlock the door. Once I got inside, I started looking around the house. Every light inside was off, except for the light in my office room. I went to take Rosa out of her cage, but when I approached it, I realized she wasn't in there. I panicked, realizing that one of us must have left her outside that morning. I went to the back door, opened it up, and called her name, but she was nowhere to be found. I shut the door and started yelling for her at the top of my lungs, and in between my shouts, I heard her bark. I listened in silence until I heard it again. It sounded like she was in the basement, but it didn't make sense. My wife occasionally works out down there, so my only explanation was that maybe she accidentally left her down there when she was working out that morning. I ripped open the door, then started walking down the stairs as I kept calling her name. She was barking like crazy, but she wasn't coming to the bottom of the steps to meet me. That's when I realized that she was locked inside the room directly to the right at the bottom of the stairs. I opened up the door and flipped on the lights, and she was there. At this point, I was starting to think that my wife was losing it, until I turned around to walk back out of the room. I saw a dark figure bolt around the corner ahead. My adrenaline immediately kicked in, and out of instinct, I chased them through the dark basement. On the far end of the room, we have a second stairwell that leads to the side of the house, and the person started running up it. Although I was badly jamming my toes on chairs and tables to chase them, I kept following, but they were too fast. By the time I got to the top and looked outside, they were nowhere to be seen. They could have run in any direction, so I knew that I lost them at that point. I called the police and had them search the house, but the intruder was wearing gloves, so they weren't able to recover any fingerprints. The strangest part about it was that they clearly went through my office, but everything was left seemingly untouched. It didn't make sense as to why they moved Rosa to the basement, and why they didn't try to leave when they heard me calling Rosa. It really seemed like that person wasn't planning on stealing anything, so it's really unsettling that they were just hiding in the dark basement. My wife and I were thankful that Rosa wasn't harmed, and none of our stuff was taken. The door leading out to the second stairwell was picked, so it was determined that the person entered through there. The following week, I ordered some home security cameras, so we'd be able to catch whoever it was in the case of this reoccurring. They arrived on a weekday night, and once my wife and I got home from work, we began setting them up. We ordered 5 exterior cameras, along with the interior cameras for almost every room of the house. While I was setting them up in the basement, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. There, tucked behind a picture frame in my wife's workout room, was a camera. I screamed for my wife, who came running down the stairs. I asked her if she put that there, but once she saw it, I knew she didn't. Again, we called the police. They didn't find any cameras except for ours, and again, they had no way of finding out who put it there. Since the break-in, my wife has been working out down there several times, and it sickens me to know that someone has been watching her the whole time. We've made lists of any potential culprits that she may think have done it, but all we can do is guess. We're both much more paranoid now, and she's very cautious around people whenever she's out. Although we feel safer with our own security cameras now, we're certainly not comfortable. Every summer, I drive home from my college back to my parents' house. This happened at the end of my freshman year, on the very first day of summer break, and it still hasn't left my mind since. I took my last final at 1 p.m. and finished around 3, so I began the 4-hour car drive back to my parents' house once that was over. I ended up arriving back home around 7, where I was greeted in the driveway by my German Shepherd named Dudley. I went inside and said hello to my parents, then started unloading everything I had packed in my car. It felt weird being back home, even though I'd lived there my entire life before college. Once I finished unpacking, my dad suggested having a campfire in the backyard, just to spend some family time together and catch up. So, around 10 o'clock that same night, I went out to the backyard with my mom, my dad, and Dudley. To add some context to the overall layout of the backyard, we have a deck and patio against the house, and a barn maybe 40 yards behind that. To the left of our barn, we'd have our campfires, which is surrounded by a few lawn chairs and a hammock. Once my dad and I got the fire going, we all sat down and started roasting some marshmallows. The conversation mainly consisted of my parents asking me questions about school and just about my life in general, so I was pretty bored after a while. We eventually got off that topic, and we started talking about where we wanted to vacation to that summer. Once we got into that, the time seemed to go by a lot faster, and before we knew it, it was already going on midnight. The forecast was calling for rain the whole night, so we opted to not put the fire out. Right before I was about to go to bed, I noticed out of the window that the fire was still going, and the barn doors weren't closed up, so I filled up a 5-gallon container of water and grabbed the key for the barn. The rain still hadn't started yet, and I wasn't surprised, considering the forecast never seems to be accurate. Once I made it to the fire, my arm felt like it was about ready to fall off, so I started dumping the water over the fire. Once it was empty, I started heading towards the barn, and this is when things really started getting weird. The wooden windows on the upper level were left open to help ventilate the musty smell inside, so I started climbing up the ladder to shut them. Within seconds after reaching the top, I froze in my steps after hearing a loud metallic thump below me. I held my breath, trying to listen if I could hear it again, but everything was silent. I chalked it up to either a tool falling over or maybe an animal, since we've had problems with them getting in the past. I shut the 2 wooden windows, then slowly descended back down the ladder, looking around the dark room for whatever it was that made the noise. Although I couldn't see much, it looked like everything was in place, so I decided to step out and lock the door behind me. But once I closed the door and reached for the key in my shorts pocket, it wasn't there. I knew with certainty that I put it in my pocket, so it had to have fallen out while I was outside. I scanned the grass as I retraced my steps back to the campfire, but it was way too dark to see anything. We usually keep a flashlight in the barn, so I turned to walk back in, but as soon as I started walking up to the barn, I once again stopped dead in my tracks. The doors to the barn were slightly open, and I had fully shut them just seconds ago. I didn't even hear the doors open, so I started questioning if I was losing my mind. I replayed the last few minutes over in my head, and I knew with 100% certainty that I shut them. I started thinking that maybe my dad was messing with me to scare me, but he'd been in bed for over an hour by this point. I felt myself getting chills, and I immediately turned around and sprinted towards my house. Once I ran up the deck, I stepped in through the sliding glass door and locked it behind me, trying to peer out through the window. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me, and there was no way I was going back out there alone. Knowing that something weird was definitely going on, I decided to wake up my dad. For the first minute, it didn't really seem like he was taking me very seriously, but after hearing the panic in my voice, he started to realize that it was serious. He grabbed his Glock that he keeps in the safe, and we both went out there together, this time with flashlights. The walk to the barn felt painfully long, and to be completely honest, I was terrified. By the time we reached the barn, the doors were still left in the same position, so I started hoping that whatever it was had left. My dad was the first to step in, as we each pointed our flashlights in every corner of the room. There were a few large objects blocking several of our viewpoints. Not long after entering, we cleared the first floor, and there was nobody in there. My dad led the way up the ladder, with his flashlight in his mouth and his gun in his hand. The top level was pretty empty, so before I even got up there, he told me it was clear. Relieved, I started climbing back down, but as soon as I reached the bottom, my dad said, "Hey, come check this out." Confused, I went back up, and once I reached the top, I could see that my dad was pointing his flashlight at a bucket that wasn't previously there. I got closer to get a better look, and what I saw was definitely not what I was expecting. The bucket was filled to the top with water balloons. We each laughed about it, and assumed it must have been some of the neighborhood kids messing around. We went back inside shortly after, and I honestly forgot about it. Well, that wasn't the end of it. About 2 weeks later, I went out to the barn to grab the lawnmower, since the grass hadn't been cut since I arrived home. As soon as I opened the barn door, I was immediately hit with an overwhelming stench of gasoline, and it didn't take me long to find the source. It was coming from the bucket with the water balloons in them. It looked like someone had dumped gasoline in the bucket, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. Each water balloon was filled up with gas, and whoever was in our barn that night was definitely not any neighborhood kids. This was serious. Whether they were planning on throwing them in our campfire that night, or at the house and lighting a match, any outcome would have been horrific. I'm not sure why they never followed through with the plan, or maybe it was just a weird prank that was meant to scare us. My parents and I don't know anyone that would do that, and we don't have any enemies or problems with anyone. I'm just glad that whatever was planned was not followed through, and neither of us have an explanation. I don't know what their intentions were, but I guess I'll never find out.